So for this week on CyberSchool, we're going to talk about troubleshooting new deployments and some issues and ways that you can get around troubleshooting some stuff. And the last week, I've been helping out some schools, particularly one school with some Polycom paging and just general troubleshooting stuff. And I figured this would be a good thing we could do to kind of talk about the different troubleshooting things that we have built into our devices and some general processes that you can use as you're going through in troubleshooting, whether it's a new deployment, an existing deployment, or you just adding in a new device. Problems will likely arise, and if you kind of understand on how to troubleshoot stuff, it'll make everything a lot easier. So to start with, so when you're dealing with new deployments, of course, especially with new deployments, typically, especially with schools and different folks that you're working with, you can change a lot when you're doing a new deployment. Typically, by the time that you're getting to, especially upgrading your phone system, you probably need some new switches and some new network infrastructure. Sometimes, physical firewalls, and typically, especially when you're putting in CyberData products, you're probably changing your phone provider, which also results in new cabling and probably new phones. And a lot of those times, everything happens at once where, you're working from, an old analog system or maybe, kind of turn of the century, funny that I can put it that way, a digital system that you could be working with. So, you're probably changing everything over at once and problems will happen, when you're, it's extremely rare to do a whole new deployment and have no issues come up. It's great when stuff like that happens, and you can definitely alleviate that by doing a lot of proper planning beforehand, but problems will come up. So, being able to troubleshoot that kind of stuff and be able to determine where your problems might be can really assist you in kind of alleviating these problems and, reducing them and conquering them pretty quickly. So all of these different things can, vary. Some common examples that we run into is just generally, your new, say intercom or your paging server, or what have you. It's not registering with, your phone system that you're working with. Maybe your multicast from your paging server, your paging server is registering, but it's not playing through your phones. Or maybe you're using something like our SIP paging adapter and connecting that to an analog amplifier. Maybe you're not getting any audio through that. Maybe you've got that intercom set up and it's registered with your phone system. It's calling the number that you want it to call, but the relay's not working. Or maybe you're trying to make calls and your outbound calls aren't working. So, there's a whole bunch of different variety of issues that you can encounter. And some of the steps that we'll go through today can really help out with troubleshooting. So in general, when you're troubleshooting, you got to start from the ground up. That age old, tech support question you get, is it connected? Is it powered on? Sir, is the device powered up? That's the first thing that you should always check. It probably is, but, that's the first place that you always want to check. You always want to check and make sure that one, the device is, actually connected to power, and two, it's getting, network information, because most of the time our devices are powered via PoE. So generally you're getting both your power and your data connection from that one cable. So it's probably connected to the network, but that's the first place to check. And furthermore, to that end, you want to check and make sure it's getting assigned the correct information. I couldn't tell you how many times people call into our tech support department and they mention, hey, I plugged my device in and it's getting the address 192.168.1.23. What's going on? Well, that's our default IP address, which means that, maybe you're trying to set it up for a VLAN and our device isn't able to communicate with the DHCP server to get the address that was assigned to it. So you might want to be able to check stuff like that. That's a very common thing. If it's not registering properly, well, is it on the right network segment? Is it able to communicate with your DHCP server? And of course, after that point, when you're dealing with devices that need to be physically connected to things like, just a regular analog amplifier wiring diagram can be super helpful, especially with some of them when you're dealing with more complex units or amplifiers that might have dip switches. Paying attention to the notes on our analog amplifier connection diagrams can be super helpful. More often than not, it's just, a simple RCA connection or maybe a tip and ring style connection with our screw down terminal. But sometimes there are dip switches that you need to adjust or specific settings on the CyberData side that you need to enable. And those are all going to be listed in the notes section of those different diagrams. And when you're working with one of our intercoms or maybe a device that, might not be connected to a door strike, it might be connected to a fire panel, you want to check and make sure that you're using the proper wire and making good connections to the relay and to the actuator of whatever you're connecting it to, and being cognizant of the different types of relays that exist out there, and making sure that you've got our relay connected to the right style device. For example, if you're trying to hook up something like a maglock for access control, those require a normally closed, temporarily open style circuit, where our relays are normally open, temporarily closed. So something like a relay wouldn't work with a maglock. So, being cognizant and understanding the types of relays out there, that can help prevent you from getting different issues when you're connecting to stuff like that. And also, just a super common one, maybe you're working in a manufacturing facility, or say a classroom or an auditorium where things can get kind of loud and you can't hear your speaker. Well, how's the volume level? If you have your volume set to 1, or sometimes even our default level of 4, that might not be loud enough for the particular environment that you're working in. So that's all just common stuff that you want to check. The basics that tech support might ask you if you call in, just so that way you can go and get all that stuff answered. All these things before you're ready to potentially get CyberData tech support involved. But let's talk a little bit more about some of these specific scenarios. So when you're dealing with audio troubleshooting, you want to, of course, adjust your volume level appropriately for the ambient noise level. Our general volume level of 4 is good for most scenarios, but if you're working in, a high ambient noise level, say a manufacturing facility with a whole bunch of forklifts, or maybe air tools and different noise, different noise sources, you might want to increase that volume level in there. But also, when you're testing stuff like this, might be, also trying to, test your multicast in addition to adjusting your volume level appropriately. You might want to stick to just dialing in your volume level first and foremost by using the CyberData test audio button on the device tab. So that way you can just play the audio file from the CyberData device and eliminate any variables that you might get from a multicast source. So that way you can just verify paging adapter and or paging server to analog amplifier, make sure that's all dialed in and working, and then test the multicast after that. So that way you're isolating variables and not adding in more potential fail points that can confuse you as you're trying to troubleshoot. And of course, it's going to be a big part of what we're going to talk about today. As you're testing everything, use the built-in test features when appropriate. When you're using any of our audio style devices, if it can output audio, it's going to have a test audio button that'll play "This is your CyberData IP speaker test message." So that way you can go and test the audio output. But some devices also have a microphone. So those relevant devices, things like our intercoms or speakers, they sometimes have microphones in them. So when they do, you've got a test microphone button. And what that does is when you press the test microphone button, it records about 3 seconds of audio and then plays it back through the speaker. It kind of kills 2 birds with 1 stone, because it tests the microphone and it actually tests the speaker itself, because it plays that particular audio file. So it's a good way to test and make sure that the physical hardware that you have is functional. If test audio works, you know that the speaker is working, and you know that the web interface of the device is working because the test audio button is clicked. And similarly with the test microphone button, the web interface is working because you click the button, the microphone is working because you tested the microphone, and the speaker is working because you heard what the microphone recorded. So with these different test audio features, you can confirm a lot of functionality out of the device. And when you're dealing with actual analog amplifiers that can be a little bit more complex, you want to confirm that connection between the audio source and the receiving device. So you want to make sure that you're using a good wire that's in between it. We generally recommend against using stripped Ethernet cables. It can get by in a pass, but we generally recommend shielded speaker wire. It's just a better connection. It's made specifically with that, where you can adapt, a stripped Ethernet cable for that, but you're dealing with extremely thin wire, and you're better suited using something like 16 gauge shielded speaker wire, just because it's more suited for the application. You want to use the right wire for the right application. Moving on, when you're dealing with networking, and this could be an entire CyberSchool on its own, is networking troubleshooting. This can be very, very complicated. But some general stuff to check is, when you're working with, in general best practices, when you're working with any telecom equipment, it should typically be on the same network segment and VLAN if you're using any kind of VLAN technology with your network. Some people do, some people don't, but really you want to focus on having all of your equipment that's going to be communicating together on that same network segment and VLAN when appropriate. The easiest way to manage your network is going to be by using DHCP reservations instead of having to statically assign every single device. That gets very cumbersome and leads to potential human error, where if you're doing everything on the DHCP server and reserving it there with the MAC addresses of the devices, it's a single pane to be able to manage everything. And that's what CyberData generally would recommend if you want to go and assign different addresses to your devices. But when you're troubleshooting, another common thing to work out, and one thing that I could spend an hour on just talking about, is multicast troubleshooting. And that can be extremely painful sometimes in terms of troubleshooting, depending on the nature of the different switches that you have, whether they're, quote, dumb switches that just pass any traffic where they're supposed to go, or they're smart switches that have things like IGMP snooping, or might need something like an IGMP queuer or a multicast queuer to actually allow multicast traffic to pass through. So depending on the make and model of your switch, it might be a little bit more complicated than others to get multicast to work properly. And that's something that when you're troubleshooting, if there's multiple hops that the multicast has to go through, you have to test individually at every hop and work your way through. It can be very cumbersome to test and troubleshoot networking related issues. Next, and a very important thing that people will frequently miss, is when you're deploying a new phone system, you really want to look at the firewall recommendations for that particular provider's firewall rules, because with the predominant use of hosted or cloud phone systems now, it's extremely popular. A lot of those providers will have different firewall recommendations for different ports and addresses that you should whitelist and have open for outbound style connections, so that way your devices will work properly. That's usually one of the first things that you want to verify if your device isn't registering properly, just to make sure that you have all of the appropriate firewall ports open and allowed. And then, of course, a common one that we'll run into, it's less common now because switches are getting a little bit smarter, but your different switch port settings and setting your device to the appropriate speed and the power level when appropriate. So that way your device is getting the appropriate power from the switch port, because they can't always negotiate the correct power from the switch. Ideally, it should all happen instantaneously just by plugging in the device, but sometimes it's helpful to verify these switch port settings manually. Finally, when we get to physical troubleshooting, and this is something that you can counter, of course, with analog systems, but also when your relay is potentially not working, or you're putting in the code, and your door is staying unlocked and it's not returning into the lock state. First and foremost, you want to check and make sure that everything is properly connected, of course, with the relay of the CyberData device, and then whatever you have it connecting to. And especially when you're dealing with access control, a common question and a common mistake that folks will get is they think that the CyberData device can supply power to the relay that we're connecting to, the actual door strike or the gate controller. They can't. Our device is just a dry contact relay, meaning that we close and then power can be passed through that. So if your relay is not working, that's one of the first things you want to check and make sure that the power source is in line in the circuit that you created and is functional and is plugged in. So that way it's actually getting power and, relaying that to the door strike of the gate controller. And when in doubt, if you're not sure if your DTMF patterns are actually getting through to actually enable the relay, just use the test relay button. It's also located in the device tab of the CyberData device. So that way you can go and actually test it and know that it's going to work with that test relay button, because that's all that does. And when you're working with analog audio, sometimes it's not going to be heard. That's generally the issue that folks will run into. You want to make sure that you've got the wiring done correctly. A lot of the times, like I was referring to, some switches or some analog amplifiers will have different dip switches that you need to adjust to disable things like phantom power, or to allow override for a particular connection point, so that way it overrides other potential audio sources that may or may not be used on that particular amplifier, just so that way you can make sure that the audio is heard. And of course, sometimes when you're working with CyberData devices, there are some settings that you will need to enable on our end, something like enable relay on local audio. That way we enable the physical relay on something like our paging adapter or our paging server to trigger the mute control in the particular amplifier that you're working with. And again, whenever you're testing something like this and you just want to confirm that the analog audio was working through that amplifier, use the test audio button. It's a known good way, and you're isolating any other potential variables from your phone system or your other audio sources. Just make sure it's working for with our device and the analog amplifier, and then add everything else in once you confirm that you've got a good connection there. So finally, to summarize everything, when you're troubleshooting, problems can and will arise when you're doing a new deployment. It's going to happen, but with proper planning, you can really minimize those. And understanding the actual troubleshooting tools and how the products work. When you're connecting, a paging adapter to an analog amplifier, we pass our audio through our outputs to its input, and then it relays that to all the different speakers. If you have a general understanding of how everything works, it makes it a whole lot easier to troubleshoot. So that way you can isolate different issues and you can make things work properly. But you don't have to consider yourself an expert whenever you're troubleshooting anything like this. If you run into issues or you're not sure what's going on and you think you did all the troubleshooting that you can do on your end, our support team is ready and available to help here at CyberData. We've got a great group of people over in our tech support team that is ready and available to help troubleshoot anything that you have going on with any CyberData equipment.
Thank you for watching this edition of CyberSchool. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They are available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831-373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.